Mega Man, Jimmy Easy. Come on.
Welcome to Advocacy Help Desk, a network of advocacy leaders sharing best practices and new ideas via this free podcast to help everyone in government affairs get better at their advocacy craft and having a lot of fun while doing it. Now to today's great show.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Advocacy Help Desk. I am your co-host, Brian Fratkin, President and CEO of Spark Influence, an industry-leading grassroots impact platform. We are here as the Advocacy Help Desk to help you with your advocacy. Everything from our great episode just recently on innovation to creativity to outreach to all sorts of different varieties of education, engagement, empowerment, all things that we do here. Answer your questions is number one. And a question we've gotten a lot of lately is all about email. But before I get to introducing today's guest, I just wanted to introduce our other co-host, Mr. DeSarno. It's good to see you.
Good to see you twice in a week. It's nice, Brian.
I know, twice in 1 week. For those that don't know, Nick here is basically heads up advocacy at the Public Affairs Council. If you're not a member and you're in our industry of public affairs and government relations, you absolutely should be. I will plug their job site as I do every week, pac.org/jobs. But we'll get to that later, as always. I have the privilege today of introducing our guest, Brian Sisolak, the Vice President of Technology Services at Trilogy Interactive. Brian, it's good to see you in person. I know we've spoken on the phone a couple of times.
Yes, you as well. Good. And, two Brians. Hopefully this doesn't get too confusing. We'll see how this goes.
Always a case, yes. Brian, where are you located, by the way?
I'm actually located up in the Pacific Northwest, up in Seattle.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. So we always do like to talk to you. And you went to college on the East Coast.
Yeah, I grew up in Washington, D.C. My parents still live there. We go back, have my kids see them all the time. I know it very well. Lived and been out here about a decade now.
Oh, wow. That's great. That's great. And 15 or 10 plus years, how long have you been working in email?
Let's just go with the 15. We'll say that for today's purposes.
For today's purposes. 15 years in email. So I'm really excited to have you on the show today, and we're really excited to have you today because email is it's always a case of email is dead, long live email, and here's how email is working and what everybody's using it for. But you shouldn't use it, and you should transfer to this. But then it's the most engaged piece, and I feel like it's got a good rap and a bad rap, and I don't know which way to think.
It has for sure, and it has always survived, and it will continue to survive. It definitely is going to change as a result of these changes out from Apple. There are some big, these are definitely the biggest changes that have had to email marketing in the last decade and a half, and how this will shift some of our tactics and our techniques. This is a big one.
This is a big one. And that's sort of what scares us all. So if we can go backwards for a second, let's talk about not necessarily the last 15 years, but at least the last, let's say 5 or 8 years or whatever sort of time frame we want to go for modern email campaign tactics. Like, what have we seen that has worked over the last sort of 8 years, 2 cycles, let's say, two presidential cycles, let's say, that's really gotten folks, that's really sort of been this renaissance of email as of late?
Yeah, I mean, it's become a big part of particularly national campaigns. Mm-hmm. It raises a lot of money and it engages a lot of people. It gets a lot of boots on the ground. It is a great way to drum up volunteers for campaigns. And yes, it raises a lot of money. It is a big portion of and the digital practices in general. I mean, I have been on every presidential nominee digital internet team. They've gone by different names over the years in the last decade and a half, and they've gotten really big. I started in this world on the John Kerry, what we called the internet team affectionately back then. And there were a few of us. They've gotten a little bit bigger since then, however.
Sure. Now, I know that, Nick, obviously you get questions day in and day out about email and effective uses of email and associations. How are associations sort of, separate from campaigns, how are associations using email, and what's that kind of driving towards with these changes and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions we get are, can you please benchmark us? What's a good action rate? What's a good click-through rate? But I think lot of times it misses, the mark of really what is your first, what are your email goals, right? What are you striving to really do by a full-fledged email program? And second, every kind of audience is a little bit different. And so we find that, one day we might be working with the American Truckers Association, right? And they are going to, digest email very differently from the American Medical Association, and the send times might be different. And so I find a lot of organizations have to really understand their audience first. But I think what everyone's trying to do is communicate in a really crowded world. And they think that sometimes a really effective email program can kind of break through that noise and get their ask or their, agenda item higher up on someone's priority list to do, whether that's, take action and send a letter to Congress, or contribute to their foundation, or, participate in other ways, attending an event or things like that. But I guess from Brian, I'm really kind of curious about, you mentioned that there's this, Apple change, and I know on Google there was a big change with like the promotions tab and folks being put in that, or the other tab. I don't even know what goes in there, but you don't want to be listed in that. How are these email, platforms changing how you're really receiving this information? How are they kind of, it's not just all one big inbox now. It's a lot around deliverability and making sure that you end up in the right, spot on Gmail or an Apple.
Yeah, totally. And this is an interesting one, because this isn't about how the end user perceives our emails. In fact, there'll be very little change. In fact, there's an improvement. And the big improvement will be with these Apple changes, that when I open my emails on an iPhone, iPad, they will open much faster. The images will render much quicker because they will already be stored on my device. So actually, from an end user perspective, this is a better user experience. This is much more targeted change at email marketers and the data that we are able to currently glean from the list. And so this change is also very different than what has happened in the past with, say, those UI changes from Gmail with the promotions tab, which of course was definitely the death of email. And I believe that was many years ago at this point. And lo and behold, email is not dead.
The death of email, I feel like we've heard that 3 or 4 times, or a dozen, or 6.
A dozen. Let's go with a dozen. Yeah,
let's go with a dozen or 6 dozen or whatever it is. I hasten to step back for a second, but let's talk sort of how are folks, before we get to the Apple change and just the pieces that means and impacts and all the other details there. What, I don't want to say what does an effective email campaign or what does an effective thing look like? And Nick, you touch on setting goals and setting audiences. What are the things that you're looking at when you're coming into a campaign, or you're coming into something and they say, look, we want to set up and we want to be effective. And how do we get started? Do we look at concentric circles of like people that we know will open it and then separate those out so that we build trust and deliverability? Or what are some of the things that you're thinking about, Brian, as you're building these campaigns to start with for clients?
Sure. So actually, Nick's comment about goals is perfect, because that actually will not change. Right. If what you're trying to do is raise $1 or have someone turn out at your event or get someone to go out and canvas for you, that's still what you're trying to do. And those metrics do not change here. Opens, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, have, a lot of people are throwing around the word vanity metric. I don't quite buy that. I think there's quite a bit of value in that open data, which will be obfuscated here in the near future. But it's not like that's the end of it all, right? We're not trying to get opens. I absolutely can run an A/B test and I can get you more opens. Sure. Absolutely get you 10, 20% more opens in segment A, but I guarantee you segment B will raise you more money. And so but to talk about concentric circles, yeah. So we'll onboard a client. I want to know how their list is built, how different cohorts behave. And this will make that kind of analysis more difficult, because the first data point we have in kind of the funnel of conversion is open. And so that's going to be much, much harder / impossible to read anymore. So we're going to be looking further down the funnel, and those numbers are just overall smaller generally to look at, which will be the challenges that are before us at this point.
Right. I like that idea of just, obviously how the list is built is number one, right? Aside from goal, right? But once you're getting into list is how do we get these people in our system, right? Is this some sort of list share? Is it a purchase? God forbid. Is it something like that? Like, how do we have these people? And then two, when you say how the cohort behaves, is that sort of asking, what did they do to get on this list? Did they purchase something? Did they make a contribution? Or is it more of, have they opened our messages in the past, or have they opened your messages in the past? Now we're trying to get them to open these messages.
Yeah. And there's also time here. I mean, we work with organizations that we have email lists that have been around. There's some records, I think, that are 15 or 20 years old at this point. We're not emailing them. And these people never opted out. They never hard bounced. The emails just kind of floated away into a dormant cohort, for example. Sure. So what I want to do is take a list, slice it into donors, slice it into clickers, slice it into openers, but also slice it by then do some other slices for, well, how was the email address acquired and when was the email address acquired?
I found this
pardon me.
Yeah, no problem. And see the behaviors when we email them. And the behaviors that we can currently see and what we're going to be able to see probably, or certainly early next year, are going to change and make that kind of analysis more challenging.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, how sophisticated do you get in some of these campaigns around like a singular ask, meaning like, we want, people to, let's say, attend this event, right? Are you doing multiple kind of emails? Or are you doing kind of campaign style where you're segmenting out and saying, okay, all the people that didn't open this are getting now this? Are you building those kind of program trees for some of these folks?
Generally, I would say no. If you have a list of 10,000, 20,000, even 100,000, it's hard to build a super complex program. You still need to understand your list. If you have a list of 5 million, that's going to be different. There's a lot more we have to do there. So it's a your mileage may vary kind of situation.
Sure.
That's great. That's interesting.
All right. We've kind of beat around the bush for 10 minutes here. But I was hoping to lead us this way, just simply to, we have a lot of advocacy groups and a lot of associations, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of corporations that have these 10,000, 20,000 person lists or 50,000 person lists. And they see it the same way that you're discussing it, which is, I'm not necessarily splitting into those people. It's a monolith is unfortunately too many times. How do you sort of, all right. So it's more of like, what are your words when pushing back against that, right? I know that you've dealt with it before where somebody's like, no, we want this message to go out to everybody. How have you sort of successfully and talked through that of being like, whoa, let's take a step back here, right? Like not everybody's the same. Here's some of the strategies that you've talked through.
Right. And this comes a lot down to delivery and deliverability. It's one of the many hats I wear. And what I want to see is if you're emailing, we'll start making up some numbers. You've got 50,000 people on your list. 10,000 of those people haven't engaged in any way.
Yeah.
They haven't converted. They haven't even clicked. Let's say maybe they've opened 3 years ago. There's just no value. Now, I'm not saying jettison them completely. And this is a big difference. Some folks will say jettison them, never email them again.
Okay.
Well, depending on what your goals are, what your mission is, what your messaging is, you may be very cyclical. You may have a time of year, particularly, on the nonprofit side, end of year fundraising, election side, every other November-ish, depending on the race. Advocacy, certainly there are moments when, in the United States, Congress isn't around, and there are moments when Congress isn't around. And you might have a message that resonates better. So I'm thinking of a campaign we had, a political campaign here in the United States. They're a Senate client. A large portion of their list was built around environmental issues and never really engaged in anything else. Well, we didn't say, well, we're never going to email them again. We said, when we have environmental issues to discuss, we're going to engage that portion of the list. And that was a client who had hundreds of thousands of emails. It wasn't huge. And a significant portion of it was built on some very specific environmental messaging from many years ago, but they still react to that specific messaging. So while I say, be careful about who you send to and pull back, there are moments when those audiences will engage, and you should embrace those moments.
Do you worry how that might affect the deliverability in the future for having a ton of people who aren't opening your message?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I will now reverse myself and say, yeah, sure, there's some portions of your list you should always jettison. I mean, if the list has been around for 15 years and you've got a portion of the list where if you email them, you get a 1% open rate and no clicks, those are not real email addresses. Those are the old throwaway Hotmail accounts someone had.
That's interesting.
I check my Hotmail all the time. Nick, I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, that's interesting. I'm learning something. I said, we have an email program at the council, so I'm always making sure we're doing the right thing. We do have kind of them segmented into like A, B, C, D, and F. And F we rarely email because they're the people that don't, respond. They don't open, they don't click, but they still might eventually kind of fold back. So we give them really soft asks every once in a while. That's interesting. Do you see that we're talking about deliverability and really, not the most sexiest stuff, but really sometimes the most important, right? And so are there other things that you find that folks are constantly kind of forgetting about? They're like, okay, what about your data hygiene? What about, these certain things that you might have been missing and that typically associations or nonprofits might do by mistake?
I was thinking about what is, in all this talk about Apple, the one thing actually that kind of keeps coming up and up in all these conversations is conversion data in the same place as where you send email.
Sure.
And a lot of folks, this is going to be one of those data hygiene processes. A lot of senders don't have their conversion data, whatever that conversion may be, in the same place where they send email. So it's really hard for them to target based on their conversion. And this applies to small entities, that are using kind of the everyday mail senders of the world, and they upload a list through a spreadsheet or something like that. And this goes also for major international brands. I mean, it has shocked me how you would think, you're like, oh, those people have a ton of money, they must be able to do it. And no, they don't either.
Right.
So I think one of the often overlooked and now going to be even more important data points is your conversion data, so that you can target based on that.
That's really
all right,
smart.
Let's get down to it. Okay. We've talked a little bit about email programs and goals and how to get started and all those other pieces. Apple is about to drop the hammer on basically preloading images. Well, just I won't get into it. Tell us what Apple's about to do. And where, and what some of the ramifications are.
Sure. And there have been some words used out in blog posts and communications to clients that are just not 100% accurate, and so lead people down the wrong path. So what Apple is going to do with the release of what's called iOS 15, which will come out in September and be widely adopted very quickly, is it will give the end user, when after you install the new version, you will open up your mail client, and there's this kind of screen that you'll pick from that will say, do you want to protect your email from evil email marketers and their spy pixels or not? And it's pretty much that dramatic. And so 100% of people are going to say, protect my email, no doubt about it. When Apple introduced app tracking, blocking app tracking in 14.5, adoption rates there were effectively 95%, kind of depending on where you were globally. This is even more dire warning to the end user than that. So let's just call it 100%. After a user does that, if they have, so the example here is, I have a Gmail account and I use the native iPhone email client, most common setup by far. What appears to be happening, and there are some what ifs unknowns here still, is that the Apple device will go to Gmail at some period of time and say, hey, give me all your emails. Okay, thanks. And then it's going to go, oh, look at all these images in this email. I'm going to go load them now. Now, usually that loading of images happens when I open an email, right? I open the email on my iPhone it then loads those images, which includes the open tracking pixel. What will happen here is those images will be pre-fetched at some period of time after the sender sends the email and before I open the email. And I, most importantly, may never open the email. In fact, I more likely will never open the email. But those images will be loaded. And so your ESP will say, oh, yep, Brian saw your email because he loaded that open tracking pixel. But all it means is that open tracking pixel was loaded onto my phone and I never saw your email, which is why, so there've been some people have said Apple's going to be blocking open tracking pixels. And it's actually kind of a little bit better way of doing it. They're just going to load them all, at least. And now I will get into the unknowns. That's what they say they're going to do. For those of us who have been testing it, it seems to be a little hit and miss. That may be intentional. That may be on purpose. It may still be in development. We don't know. There's definitely some like everyone's waiting for this thing to come out and go to scale because we don't exactly know what the plan is here and how far Apple will take this, the changes they may make. But they have been very intentional that their goal is to prevent email marketers from having several data points, one of them being opens.
So when is Apple going to come out with their product where they sell you a email marketing tool that helps you do all this, right? Is that their next step?
I don't think so. There is a major mailbox provider that sells data. And it's Verizon. They were recently acquired, so AOL Yahoo. It's on their Postmaster blog. It's not a great secret, but they do sell some aggregate data. Let me be very clear about that. But no, Apple has put a stake in the ground about privacy. And there are certainly folks in the industry who believe that will happen. You're right, Nick. I am not one of them. I think Apple has put their stake in the ground so much so that someone recently noted that Apple's Postmaster site even talks about using opens to call your email list and only send to people who want to receive your email. You should use opens for that. And the other side of Apple, over on the iOS development side, goes, man, nope, we're not going to give you that data anymore.
Yeah. So the coming Armageddon, right?
Yeah. I said the wrong thing. I said you're not going to get that data anymore. See, I just did it there. You will get the data. You will be flooded with inaccurate data.
Right. So where you might have had a 20 or 30% open rate before sending, and it's not just, of course, folks at me.com, but it's at gmail.com or outlook.com. Anybody that has hooked up those systems to their default mail app will be affected.
Correct. And it happens on iOS, iPad OS, which is slightly different. And it will also happen with the Apple Mail client on desktops. That's going to be a slower adoption.
Okay, so that's not necessarily rolling out September 15th, or is it, and it will just be a slower adoption, or is it coming out later this year?
No, just because of the way OS updates work, not every Mac can get the OS update.
Sure.
And so that's just going to be over the next year, we'll have more and more users who adopt, and Mac updates are not the super easiest sometimes. So if to actually upgrade to Mac OS Monterey, which is the OS that will have this feature in it, will just be slightly slower. It will still be there, and give it a year, give it two, it'll be significant.
So how are you kind of preparing your clients for this change? What are some of the things that you're doing other than just telling them?
We're telling them, but I will also say it is very difficult because no one really knows.
Right.
Testing the beta for the last, I've been doing this at 2 months, I feel like now, which maybe feels like 2 years. It's inconsistent, the behaviors. We don't know how it's going to behave at scale. Maybe it's not as bad as we think, or it's going to start that way. But then over the next couple of months, Apple will kind of take the dial and turn it up a little bit. They may then turn it back a little bit. Like we just don't, and Apple has not said and will not say. So it's a little bit of a wait and see, even with the major email service providers that send most of the email for the entire world. Everyone is just in a little bit of a wait and see. The worst case scenario is that sometime by the end of October, we have these massive open rates. And so if you had an email list and you were saying, well, today, so I talked to you about your A, B, and C cohorts earlier, Nick. My A cohort is everyone who has opened in the last 6 months, donated in the last year, or clicked in the last 8 months, right? Pretty common kind of active definition that we would use. That cohort's going to get much, much larger. And your rates, your open rates will be really high, but your conversion rates will be really low, which will make things like testing really hard to do because you've inflated these numbers. So there's going to be a lot of moving to clickers. Instead of openers in the last 3 months, you're going to be looking at clickers in the last 2 years, potentially. That is one of the data points we're going to have to move to. And this goes back to getting conversion data into wherever you're sending email from. You definitely need to have that data point available. We might still be able to use opens for a while. I'm not totally writing them out. You may be able to ride this out until the end of the year, into 2022. You might be able to snapshot. One thing we just thought about yesterday is when iOS 15 comes out, we're going to be snapshotting like last open date for all of our clients, just so we have a record, so that if this really is as bad as we think it is, we can use that snapshotted data for a couple of weeks or months while we adjust strategies.
I like that one. That's an interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think I'm going to be forwarding the recording to this to our email people. Be like, because I haven't heard anything. This is news to me.
And to be totally fair, Nick, this is not just an issue of lack of communication in our spaces. Even the major mailbox providers, and I'm going to pick on MailChimp, not to pick on them, just to use a very recognizable brand. Sure. As far as I'm aware, they have not communicated to their clients that this change is coming. Right. That's a huge user base, right? A lot of small e-commerce shops. And those folks really use open rate a lot. I suspect they have no idea this is coming. I mean, I live in a email geeks bubble, whether it's on Twitter or in Slack. Like everyone I know knows about it, but there are tens of thousands of clients out there for different platforms they have not been communicated to yet, partially because those of us who have seen it are like, what exactly is this going to do? Well, we think this is what it's going to do, but we don't know. And there are some potential technology changes on the email service provider side. Someone from one of the major providers I was just talking to about an hour ago, we're talking about, well, we may move to here's your open rate with Apple, here's your open rate without Apple, just to kind of give you a metric to start to use. But do they need to do that? Even they don't know yet. So there's a little bit of wait and see here, which is why those are the unknowns.
That was exactly what I was thinking. Is like, can we pull segment it and see what the difference is?
You certainly can. And there are several tools that show you the two largest in the space are Litmus and Email and Acid will show you what devices are being used. And they can see who is behind the Apple image proxy. And so let me dive into this a little bit because this will be important. One of the big things that I have always, and most email marketers have harped on for a long time is like, hey, everyone opens on mobile. You have to be mobile optimized. Like, look at your mobile data. One of the data points we will lose here is if people are opening on an iPhone, iPad, or Apple Mail. All that gets obfuscated behind a image proxy that Apple is kind of putting in the way and stripping out that little bit of information for us.
Wait, and to clarify, to interrupt 1 second there, the idea is,
the dog is very engaged in this conversation as well. I guess what he's asking is, will you be able to tell where your mobile audience is now? Will that potentially be,
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. No, this gets dramatically changed. It already has dramatically changed though, and that's often glossed over. So Gmail already proxies images. They don't do this pre-fetching, which is the issue with open rates, but they do proxy our images. So we don't know if someone is loading in the Gmail app on an Android, Gmail app on iOS, or Gmail on the web client. So already that information is kind of obfuscated. This now takes pretty much the remainder of everyone else and obfuscates it as well. So those tools, aren't, we'll have to see where they go. But I mocked up something the other day, and it was essentially, these are the 4 proxies that we know are going to be loading our images: Apple, Gmail, Yahoo, and to a lesser degree, Microsoft. And for B2C, for campaign email lists, those worlds, that's 90% of opens. So all you're going to know is the proxy that the image loaded through. You should just assume that more than 50% of your opens are on mobile, and you're safe.
That is just, I think that's the part that I didn't even think through, was that it's not even going to let you see that it was open on an iPhone or open on an iPad. It's now just going to be the Apple proxy that's going to take over from there. And I hadn't really thought through that. It's obviously going to be everyone, as we mentioned, everyone who's just opening their messages through the native app, whether they have an Outlook account, Hotmail account, Yahoo account, whatever it is. I mean, we all sort of have an iPhone that you just hook up your email through the app, and that's how it goes. So you're losing a lot. It feels like a lot of data and a lot of different pieces here.
Yep. And we'll be losing, now this is less relevant, but we will be losing IP address of open. We will still get a region, which, and again, there's so many proxies already out there in the world. This is not an oft-used feature. Doing really highly geo-targeted emails based on IP address. And I'm just going to throw out a solution. Just ask people where they are. There's a lot of talk about first-party data, but actually zero-party data, which is where you actually ask people and they tell you what they want, like engage with your email list. So we lose IP address. We lose the ability to get mobile versus desktop. We're also going to lose the ability to do things like countdown timers. That are counting down to a midnight deadline. So all the campaigns out there in the world say, donate before midnight, here's a big giant clock. If you do that, that clock, if you open it after midnight, will still be counting down to some random time. So that's another big kind of tactic that we will be losing as a result of this.
And so it seems like, and this is happening in the advertising world too. And, is it's just becoming harder to target, right? It's becoming the wild, wild west of data is no longer there. The idea, especially for political campaigns, that you could spend a very little bit amount of money, have hyper-targeted Facebook ads or all these things, seem to be the previous era. As it just becomes, it's harder and harder to use some of this data. Do you see that kind of happening in the long run in email? And what are some of the ways is it now creative taking over and context taking over as being more important than being hyper targeted, and are those types of, that kind of becoming the focus of how to break through some of this?
Yeah, totally. You're absolutely right. Apple first went about app tracking. The browsers, Google, Chrome have removed abilities for tracking. Obviously, the Facebook API years ago used to let us do crazy things that we can't do anymore. There were some great tools built on that. And then there were some nefarious tools built on those features. So they've all, the dials have gotten turned down a little bit. And I will say rightfully so. I think the consumers do not realize how much data is out there about them. So those dials have been turned down. So we need to ask people for what they want. We need to understand. You can't just blindly email a million people saying, turn out for this event in Cincinnati. Like, they're not in Cincinnati. And so it becomes more challenging, but at the same time, more interesting, right? We get to actually know who the people on our list are moving forward. We're not just going to treat them as giant batches of records that, they opened at some point in the last year. So I think there are also some opportunities. Conversely, I will say, some senders might decide things like, we were talking earlier about your A, B, C, D cohorts. Maybe this won't be as dramatic of a change as we think. And so open rates aren't going to 50, 60, 70%. They're going to hover in the 30% range. Well, maybe we will continue to call openers engaged. And we know some portion of them aren't, but, it wasn't as bad as we thought. And then I'm going to, replug we don't really know. And that's also why people haven't communicated about it a ton, because we don't know what the future holds. I think at the moment, there are now 5 iOS betas that have come out for developers, and they haven't really changed in their behavior. And this is probably the last beta before the release. Maybe there's 1 or 2 minor updates at this point. But until it comes to scale, we just don't know, except for what Apple has explicitly said in the interface. And Apple has the resources to do what they say they want to do, it will be as dramatic as we think.
I have a quick one then. You mentioned more zero-party data. In the association space, we are lucky enough to have a lot of that information with folks, membership and other things. They're members of associations, they're members of, they're employees of corporations. But let's talk about CCPA and GDPR for a second, right? The privacy compliance items. If we're asking for more data, we're opening ourselves up to saying, well, this is now data that we need to have to be able to target more effectively. And so it's almost going against what the thought was to put those in place. And I just, it's just, there's so much going on here.
There are some weird scenarios or ideas that actually are going to go against what Apple is going for. So one, for example, is that we send more email because we say, you know what? I don't know who's a real opener versus a fake opener, and it doesn't cost me a ton of money to send that email. My deliverability is fine, so send more email. The other one is there are several products out there at the moment, and I suspect there may be more, for example, where there is anonymous sharing of click data. And because I don't know who is a real opener, I need to at least know that someone has clicked an email on some list somewhere in the last 6 months. And those products exist already, but there may be more of them. And so Apple may have created this world where there is more data sharing. Now, that's a US specific comment. Obviously, GDPR makes that much more difficult / impossible. And so, with GDPR and CCPA and potentially federal legislation in the United States, different podcast, different time, for sure.
Sure.
It is becoming more important that we protect the data we do have as well, and that we respect. And this is all about respect of data and what consumers want or our recipients want. Because right now, if they ask us to erase their data and we are in Europe, we have to erase their data. There is no we think we erased your data. We have to respect the erasure requests. And so we will have more data about them, but only if they provide it to us.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I'm hearing is, when campaigns first start, it's build your email list, right? Like that's one of the most important things to do. And it's now, it also seems like build your email list, but also make sure that you have your own data as well. And that you not necessarily can always rely on getting data from third party or sources, that you might, want to be really communicating from the beginning to know who is on that email list and what they care about and where they're located, rather than, finding it elsewhere.
That's right.
Kind of thing, right?
That's right. Yeah. Ask people what they care about. That may be the best quote of the day, actually.
Ask them what they care about.
Yeah. And there is also this, to go back to the weird things that Apple might cause us to do, is kind of, I hate to use the term clickbaity, but clickbaity emails about tell us what you are interested in. And it's for 2 reasons. It's to see that the person is actually on the other end, but also to actually, and don't just do it and be like, you ask about, here are 6 topics. Which are you interested in? Record the data. Don't just get it for the click. Know what the user wanted. Mark that record as interested. Tag them, whatever you do in your different platform. Don't just do it to get the click.
Don't just do it to get the click. There you go. That's parting words on a heck of a conversation. Look, Brian, I have a page full of notes here that are illuminating and enlightening and all those other great words of wow. Yet it's still unknown as to exactly what's going to happen. So fascinating stuff. No, we really appreciate you being on today. One, for the history of, not history of email, but just sort of the sort of last sort of 8 years of how email's been used. Some great tips, both from Nick and from you, on what we need to think about when we get started with email, and how we need to separate these folks out, and what we may need to think about now in the future given these changes. I mean, it's an interesting sort of overlap here that really does affect a lot of different ways that folks are communicating and the different groups that they're communicating with. So with that, I wanted to say thank you to you both. Thanks, Nick, for joining us from London another night. And Brian, thank you for joining us from the lovely Pacific Northwest. As a fellow DC native, I wish I could get out of town right now. It's one of those super hot August days. But here we are. Thanks again to both of you. And this is one of those that I know is really, really important to a lot of folks in the space. So it's really great. Andy Polk can't join us again, but he'll be back in early September. Until then, in the words of Andy Polk, keep advocating.